Yeah, welcome to this series two of the podcast on development economics. We have with us Arvind Ilaraman, who is joining us from University of Chicago. Hi, Arvind, how are you?
Good one. Thank you for having us again.
Yeah, thank you for being here with me. Now we have Sanjukta Basu, who is joining us from Toronto, Canada. Hi, Sanjukta, how are you?
Hi Manhar, I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing good actually. And thank you. So now we have with us Mehek Rastogi, who is joining us from Delhi. Hi, Mehek, how are you?
Hi, Manhar. Good, good. How are you?
Yeah, doing good. Yeah. So let's, come to the subject of discussion uh, of this podcast, which is in continuation to the last podcast. So, Arvind, why don't you introduce the topic for us?
Sure, Manhar. In today's podcast, we basically want to talk about how should a nonprofit decide what data to leverage at different stages of a project.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as we discussed in the last podcast, nonprofit organizations operate in the development sector.
Mm-hmm.
They usually serve one or more social causes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they pursue various projects that are aligning with their mission and vision in solving these social problems.
Yeah.
For example, high school dropout rates being very high among teenage girls in rural India is one very clear social problem that we have.
Yeah, I saw that
And
it's close
usually,
to 50% by the time, girls reach 11th standard. 57% of the girls are dropping out. Yeah, so that's like an alarming, you know.
exactly. And there are different non-profits operating in different areas in health, education,
Yes,
etc., trying to solve this common social problem, right?
yes,
So
yes,
usually a project of a non-profit in this case will involve designing and delivering an intervention to solve the problem. For example, doing community information campaign on women empowerment
mm-hmm.
could potentially reduce high school dropout rate for girls. Now, that is what brings us to the question of today's discussion. How should a nonprofit decide what data to leverage at different stages of a project,
Mm-hmm.
which is nothing but an intervention designed to solve a social problem? Now,
Okay.
why should we be concerned about this, right? It's a natural question.
Yes,
Uh, Mainly because currently a lot of focus on using data, especially in evidence-based policy making,
yes,
perspective, is being used by organizations as accountability measures, right?
yes,
For example, something that is very visible and easy to measure as indicator of an impact can be used because it's easy to report to the donor and show that there has been impact, right?
okay,
But maybe the organization actually wants to depend on something long term and something maybe a little bit difficult to measure to
okay,
actually run the project for the long term.
okay,
In the following discussion, we will basically divide a project into different stages
uh-huh,
based on what we want to learn in that particular stage, or basically what are the learning objectives for that particular stage. Now,
okay,
the different stages we have defined for this are what normally people call as needs assessment,
uh-huh,
and then intervention design, and then monitoring the implementation of the intervention,
uh-huh,
and then evaluating whether the intervention created an impact,
uh-huh,
and finally using the data for improving the process and project as feedback,
okay,
right?
okay,
uh, so basically a non-profit project is a complex system involving organizations, institutions,
uh-huh,
beneficiaries, other
uh-huh,
stakeholders,
uh-huh,
resources, etc.
uh-huh,
The purpose of data is to help us map and measure various parts of this system
yes,
for monitoring of performance,
mm-hmm.
evaluation of the intervention, and
Mm-hmm.
improvement of the implementation itself.
Yes,
And a systematic way to decide what data to measure and leverage,
mm-hmm.
we are basically arguing should be based on very well-defined learning objectives, which are aligned with the program expectations. And I will let Sanjukta and Mehek discuss these different stages.
Yes. Yeah. So now that given a primary, discussion on this topic, so I would, bring Sanjukta in now, and she can talk more about the steps, which are involved in addressing the socio-economic problems that has been identified. Yeah, Sanjukta.
Great. Thank you, Manhar. So, great intro, Arvind, and just really set the stage for what I want to say.
Yeah.
So, you're right. So it's a systematic way of, deciding or like designing a program of just going forward from the next step. So, I think the first step should be we should know what social problem that the organization is wishes to address. Like we started with our conversation on women empowerment and dropout rate. So we know on which area or which ballpark we are playing around in. So
Mhm.
once we are very clear with defining the problem and why we are choosing to focus on this problem,
Mhm.
the organization should be clear on what aspect of the goal they want to work with. Like for female empowerment is a very broad goal.
Yes.
You can narrow it down and say, how about improving girls' literacy? Because that will definitely lead to eventual female empowerment.
Yes.
So once we are very clear on the social problem, we have understood it and we have locked on it. The next step would be to identify the ecosystem in which the social problem exists.
Yes.
Step 2 focuses on conducting a need assessment.
Yes.
So now, like Arvind said, we should have a learning objective in each stage. So
Yes.
in stage 1, we knew what we want to do. Stage 2, while doing the lead assessment, our learning objective is to understand the needs of the situation, of the beneficiaries, the different ways to implement the interventions, pros and cons. What
Uh-huh.
like basically what is the existing literature telling us? People
Uh-huh.
that we want to speak with, we'll go speak with them. The step is basically a literature review where we not only looked at what's there on the internet, but also talk to various stakeholders, beneficiaries, people who have worked in the sector, and they explore the list of available resources. At the end of this stage, we should understand the different ways we could potentially address the social issue that we're looking at. So
So that is sort of doing a due diligence of, what is out there and what, one needs to know, correct?
yes, just doing the due diligence. So maybe after we do this whole research or due diligence, we can narrow down our female empowerment to improving girls' literacy, and then we figure out there's a multiple ways of doing it, and we list the top three, which makes sense in based on our our expertise, the organization's expertise, and their interests. So one of them could be how about increasing attendance of girls. Then second, how about technology, introducing learning mobile applications. And maybe the third could be engaging parents. So now we have these list of all these information that we collected in this stage. So we use this information and move to step 3, where we design our intervention, which will address the problem that we chose in step 1.
Okay.
And this program that we design, it needs to cause the most impact by using the available resources efficiently.
Okay.
And that's the keyword. We want to do the most we can, but we need to be very efficient on what we have.
Okay.
And at the end of this stage, that the design stage, we need to design something we call a logical framework analysis. Like a nice, very visually very clear about the program, where where the life cycle of the program is very clearly defined and what inputs we need to put, such as what donors we need to contact with, what kind of training we need to give our staff, maybe the mobile application that we would need if you're choosing to move in introducing learning through mobile applications.
Yes.
Second step would be maybe list a number of activities we need to do. Do we need to do a outreach program? Do we need to do a webinar to ensure that people download the app and activate them?
Okay.
Then outputs. Maybe the output would be the games that the kids are going to play, where at the end of this game, we will know that, okay, they have completed the game. So we get information on that.
Okay.
Finally, some information on the outcome, maybe learning, if there's been an overall improvement in learning, and finally the impact that we want to look at. So this thing should be visually in front of us very clearly to know how we are going to move during the cycle of the program.
So as it is, clearly visible in the slide. it's
Yep.
it's a step-by-step scientific
Yes, that's correct.
method of addressing the challenge,
Yeah.
right?
And I know the word, the logical framework analysis and the graph can look intimidating. So we are hoping to cover this aspect, the LFA, in more detail in the next podcast.
This will be the subject of discussion of the next podcast, logical
Yes.
framework analysis.
Yep.
Okay. Okay. Now, we have seen how visually captivating, the logical framework analysis, looks like in front of us. So given that, Mehek, I want you to come in now and, explain to us what is the next step in all of, this.
Right. Thanks, Manar, and also thanks, Sanjukta, for just taking us through like the design aspect. So once the design of a project has been sort of finalized, we
Mhm.
basically move into the implementation phase. And with the implementation phase comes the monitoring phase. So here, what we are doing is obviously you're doing a set of activities, but you're also trying to understand whether or not we're going in the right direction. So again, we have to use some learning objectives. So now if I have to think about what are some of the learning objectives that we are covering, the first would be to understand, do I have the resources to implement the project or not? For example, do I have the right amount of funding? Do I have a team for execution? Right. So these are some of the things that I will think about. Then am I going to actually say that, are we going according to the plan? So this is when we're collecting data to see if we're being able to complete our activities. This is also the phase where we are trying to understand, are we doing things right?
Okay.
Right. Right. The third step would be to understand if we're even doing the right things or not. For example, if our assumption is that conducting a student webinar will increase the mobile application usage, was it the right bet or not? Or was it that maybe we should have done something like teacher training? Maybe that got girls to use the application. Maybe actually getting the students to interact with each other and have like a peer group learning might have been a better bet. So when we're executing our program, it is important to continuously think about this. The last stage of the program is when we are actually monitoring things at the outcome level, right? This is to learn whether or not our action or our design actually led to our intended outcome. What were some of the enablers? What were some of the disablers? And mostly when we look at outcomes, they're evaluated at a short-term level, a medium-term, and a long-term level, where we collect the data through quantitative, qualitative methods, through research methodologies, which help us understand, okay, did we even reach where we intended to reach? Did the girls actually participate in the program the way we wanted them to? Did it improve learning outcome? Did it actually reduce dropouts or not?
Yeah.
Right? Now, essentially, all of the data that we've collected in this entire stage is helping us understand what happened, right? What it's not really telling us is why things happened that the way they did, right? So we then at the end need to be able to look at data in a holistic manner. We need to look at the data collected across different stages to understand, okay, why and what both combined, and draw like an analysis for it. And that's where the feedback loops are coming.
Okay. Okay. So, given such a detailed, framework of, how you should address this. Now, I would like to bring Arvind, who can talk more about the data, part of it. The data has been collected, right? So then how do you use that data to improve the program evaluation, Arvind?
Sure, Manhar. I think it's very easy to think of feedback in the normal sense, right? So basically, you want to identify what did not work, and you want to mitigate that problem. And also you want to identify what worked, and you want to utilize those factors more efficiently to increase your impact. But this cannot happen as a one-off exercise at the end of a project, where the team comes together and then looks at how the overall life cycle went, and then decides on how to change different components in the next project. In order to have continuous learning and continuous improvement, thinking about feedback mechanism has to be a daily thinking habit, right? But such a process can also lead to people abusing the data counterintuitively to micromanage projects and teams.
Oh, okay.
So that is why we
Yeah.
insist on defining learning objectives for data,
Okay.
including in the feedback stage,
Okay.
because you want to be able to clearly define early on that the data I'm collecting is going to act as feedback in this way by answering this question, right?
Okay.
Otherwise, you might use the same data to draw some conclusions that are not actually very reasonable. So
Okay.
basically, learning objectives in the case of feedback, they define the scope of what can be plausibly answered with the data that we have collected,
Mhm.
so that if there is any deviation from the expected pattern,
Mhm.
then we investigate why that is happening. It can be positive or negative, but this deviation is basically what tells us that there is something more to understand over there, right?
Yes.
Therefore, at each stage of the project we have discussed so far, we can imagine an internal feedback process. So we want a feedback receptive mindset in any decision-making stakeholder, be it the nonprofit professional, analyst, leadership, or other stakeholders. Some of the learning objectives that we can define for the feedback stage within the intervention design or monitoring stages, particularly, something like, did we implement the activities as per the design?
Okay.
Or do we need to change the project design by changing the activities, right?
Okay.
For example, the notion of using learning objectives to define the scope of the feedback process becomes important in this case, because, for example, without clearly defining the learning objectives, you can use the data as feedback to change a very core component of your intervention that you shouldn't be changing. Like if you observed inefficiencies of the nonprofit or school in organizing parent teachers meeting to improve, parental engagement to reduce high school dropout for girls, because they're looking at an inefficiency in this meeting process, if you decide to not do the physical meeting but move all these interaction to WhatsApp groups, the lack of physical connection between the parent and the school can actually have a negative impact, which we are experiencing unintentionally. So that's the reason why you have to think about feedback within each stage, but based on the learning objectives you have defined for each stage, right? So that's why, so that's a systematic way of very clearly defining how to use the data responsibly, basically across the project's life cycle.
Yeah, so I just want to, stick to this example, that you gave me. So when you use WhatsApp, group, okay, WhatsApp acts as a tool to communicate, but in the context of something like a parent-teacher meeting, where, teacher obviously the teacher message to the parents might not go through completely through WhatsApp, right? The message might be lost. And that is the point I would like to make. Correct, Arvind?
Yeah, definitely. Having the physical interaction builds a much better sense of a bond or relationship. So I think that is very difficult to achieve through, mobile interactions.
Yeah, and so that is why the use of technology here is not, helping us achieve that outcome that we want, right, as a society in this case. Because if the relationship is strong, then the parent
Right.
sort of, gets a message, okay, this is what I need to do with my child, or this is what I should force my child to do. And that is actually for his or her betterment in the long run. Correct?
Basically, technology or any such intervention component is contextual only, right? It has to be suitable for the situation in which we want to use it.
Yes.
And basically, what we are telling is sometimes if you don't use the data responsibly, you can make wrong decisions based on the same data. And that is what we want to avoid by focusing on learning objectives, basically.
Yeah, so the program intervention here should be to encourage, both parent and teacher to meet physically, correct?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Any other point, Mehek, Sanjukta, or Arvind, apart from this?
I would like
I-
to add a little bit on the technological aspect of it. I think
Mhm.
what we need to know here is not which tool is efficient, like not make a general statement about which tool would be good or bad, but what works where. For instance, maybe WhatsApp message will not convey or build the bond that it needs to bond. However, with these parents who are involved, like we are talking about communities, we are vulnerable and have a lot of other challenges except the one that we're addressing.
Mhm.
So reaching out to parents through WhatsApp may be the only way of communication that is physically possible. So even if we remove that option completely, there could be parents that we would not be able to reach out at all. So
Okay.
I'm trying to say that I'm not actually making an argument for or against technology. I'm trying to say that what works or not works is what the feedback thing is doing.
Okay. And you need to collect the data to back up your claim, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And be open to, the open to all these, the loops, the feedback loops that just because something worked in some other maybe in some other program for the same beneficiaries, doesn't that will work for you. So that's when you go back and check if it did. Can something else work better? Can something be like additional support with what our initial intervention was?
Yeah. Got it. You need to measure your intervention and not have conjectures about, what you think can work, right?
Huh.
Correct. And that's the reason why you're essentially collecting data at every stage, right? You're
Yes.
not just collecting data at an output level or only at the end of the program. You're collecting data as you go. So you're tracking your activities, you're tracking your actions, you're taking feedback on those actions. Then you're seeing that have the bets worked or not worked. And then finally, you're actually also trying to see that did the bets that you put down or the outputs that you put down actually lead to the impact or not? Or were there some other factors that led to it? So when you're designing a program, the fundamental thing is that we want to achieve the intended outcome. We want to make a difference to those girls. And if we want to make a difference, there are multiple ways to make a difference. Are we doing it right? Are we doing the right things? Is where we want to be able to learn.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. That sort of, I think, drives from the point that the podcast was intended to be, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. So that's it for this podcast, three of you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Manat, for
Yeah.
having us.
Yeah. Thank you. And I'm eagerly looking forward to the next podcast and, talking to three of you again. All right then. Take care.
Yep.
Yeah.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Bye,
man.
Sanjukta. Bye,
Take
Arvind.
care.
And bye, Mehek.
Bye,
Bye.
Manhar.
Bye.